Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial where today we're going to be taking a look at Adobe Lightroom. And for those of you not familiar with Lightroom, this is Adobe's dedicated raw file editor. And it's really great if you're looking to work on hundreds, if not thousands of images at a time. Now, it's very specifically working with raw files, and if you're not familiar with a raw file is effectively like a digital negative. If you kind of think about back when we used to have film, you know, you'd shoot all your film and then the roll of film wouldn't actually be any good to anyone until it had been developed. And normally you go and do that in a darkroom, except that today we do it in Lightroom, hence the name. So, before we get started, let's take a look at kind of how the program is laid out, because there's two important features that you kind of are going to want to focus on. And they are the library module, which is basically where you sort and organize all of your photos and do all that fun stuff. And then the develop module, which is effectively where you do all of the editing. Now, Adobe do have a series of these other modules, but they're more or less useless in my opinion. They're not anything I personally use, but you know, if you want to geotag stuff or you know, publish stuff automatically to Facebook, then you can set that up if you like. I don't personally do it. So anyway, the two core things you need to pay attention to are the library and the develop. And before we can do anything with those, we need to actually have some images to work on. So in order to do that, I'm currently in the library module, and you need to go down to import, and then it's conveniently located the folder that I was looking for, which has got some photos that I took on a recent trip to Germany. If it doesn't take you straight to the folder, which it probably won't, you will need to just navigate to it on your computer using this little file structure here. And I will also just mention that sometimes if you've got a fresh install of Lightroom, it will pop up looking like this. Just click this little arrow here and that will go full screen and you can see what you're doing. Now, I'm just going to make sure that all of these are ticked, and I'm going to hit import. And now Lightroom is going to start to load these in. And although we're importing them, it's not actually like creating a copy of them somewhere on your computer and then saving them in the software. It's basically referencing where these files live on your hard drive and kind of just pulling the information from there. So if you were to take your files and then move them somewhere else, Lightroom would kind of be like, hey, where did you put this? And it will give you a little question mark and that sort of thing. So do bear in mind that you kind of do have to leave your files where they are for as long as you're going to edit them. And it's now going to start building some previews and thumbnails and that kind of thing just for internal use inside of Lightroom. So now that we've got the library module open, let's talk about how you go through and you sort your pictures, because that's kind of the main thing with this. And it's really good if, you know, you've shot a wedding or something like that and you do have 1,000 or so pictures to go through. You can do this quite quickly. So, for instance, I've got a lot of sort of duplicate shots of things, and, you know, I obviously don't want to use 3 exact shots of the same car, so we want to kind of pick some of these out. There's a few ways of doing that. You could use a star system, which is one way that a lot of people and a lot of programs offer you as an option to organize things. Or you could use a color rating system. Again, very similar, but my personal preferred way of working in Lightroom is I use the flag system, which is down here. And the basic idea of that is that you can right-click, set flag, and you can set it as flagged, unflagged, or rejected. But having to right-click and do all that is a massive pain. So I use the keyboard shortcuts. And the keyboard shortcut to flag something is P, which will give it a little white flag. And if I just click off of that image, it's also going to put a white box around the image to say that you have selected this shot. If I wanted to remove that flag, you can hit U on the keyboard, and that's going to unflag your shot. And if you want to, you can actually reject photos, so you can hit X on the keyboard, and it's going to reject it, and it's also going to grey that photo out. And that one I find a little bit superfluous, because you really don't need to do that, in my opinion. Let me show you why. So I only really want to select the photos that I'm going to use. If I haven't flagged something, if I leave it as unflagged, that's my head saying, well, I'm not going to use it. So, you know, you don't need to do all this extra work of rejecting all the ones that you don't want to use, unless you really want to. So the quickest way to kind of whiz around in here is there's a few different view modes that we can use. We can, if we just hit the spacebar, go full screen on any particular image. To go back to that grid view, if you hit G on the keyboard, it will let you go back. Now, the one that's really useful when you're actually kind of filtering through your images, if we select, let's say like 6 of these, and I've just done that by clicking one image holding shift and clicking the next one, up to the image that I want to select, sorry. If you hit N on the keyboard, it's going to bring them up in this kind of view here, where it's just going to show you the ones that you've got selected. And actually, if we want to see these a little bit more clearly, we can get rid of these tabs on the side either by clicking them, or if you just hit Tab on the keyboard, whoops, did not mean to set rating to 1 there. If you hit Tab, it will get rid of those sidebars. So now that we've got these images up here full screen, we can go through and we can start picking the ones that we want. So I might look at these and go, right, well, I don't like these two because I've got a black thing in the corner, really. So I guess we'll go with that one. And I quite like the one where he's not looking at us, so we'll take that one. And then I can click and shift click to select the next lot of images and go again. So those are out of focus. I think that's got a bridge in it. I think I quite like that one. And we can just do this for all of the images as we go. So I like that one. I don't like those. I quite like that one. And go through here. Go for that one. And then we've got, I can see there's like 5 images here that all look sort of the same. And we'll just pick our favorite out of these, or a favorite couple. We could do whatever. You don't just have to pick one each time, obviously. So I quite like that one, and I think we'll go for that one as well. And you can see how quite quickly you can get through a lot of images, and you can see these in pretty good quality, you know, while we're working on them. So I quite like that one, and those two as well. Actually, like both of those. And then we've just got 3 here at the end, and I think we'll go for the last one. Okay, so now if we hit G, we can go back to our grid view, and you can see we've got a bunch of images with flags on. And that in itself isn't particularly helpful, but what is useful is the fact that we can now filter them by their flag rating. You can also filter by star rating or color rating. Oh, by the way, just while we're on the topic of this, I will just mention that if you wanted to do star rating, so let's say we could have, if I hit N, we've got all those pictures of the inside of the car up, we could say, well, that one's a 1 star, and you just use the numbers 1 through 5 and 0 if you want to remove the rating on your keyboard. So it's like, well, that's like a 2. I think, you know, that one's like a 4 maybe. That one's similar. That was a 3. And then you can go, right, well, I just want to select is greater than or equal to 4. And then we've just got those 2 that come up. So they're the only ones that were 4 stars or greater. And now out of these 2, we can say, well, actually, yeah, I like the one on the right more. Actually, saying that, no, I don't. I like the one on the left more. So what I'm going to do is, because this has actually got a flag on it, I'm going to hit U to unflag that, click this one, and I'm going to hit P to flag it. Simple as that. And now we can go back to our grid view, and voila. So what we can do is filter by flag, and so we can filter it to only show the flagged images. And now we've culled our images down to just a small selection of what we had, and they're just the ones that we want to use and go forward with. So now that that's done, and by the way, we haven't deleted the other ones, obviously, we're just filtering what we're able to actually see. But now that we've filtered these down, we can go over to the develop module. And this is kind of where the action starts to happen. So if we go down to our first image here, you can see that we're now in this window here where we've got a load of different stuff on the right hand side here. You've also got things like your presets and stuff like that, and a history and loads of cool stuff on there, but I generally leave that off. And, you know, basically the way Lightroom's editing works, it's sliders. You can just play around with these until you're happy with your image. And there's a lot of stuff we could look at in here, but today we're just going to be focusing on this basic tab. And I think one thing to get in your head straight away when you're doing Lightroom, and I've seen lots of people make this mistake in the past, is just because you have all of the sliders doesn't mean you need to use all of the sliders. And particularly, often less is more with these things. You don't just want to go smashing everything to the ends because it just doesn't look very good. And that's just something to bear in mind kind of as you're going through with this, because you know, there's a lot of powerful stuff here, but if you get a bit heavy-handed with it, it quickly falls apart. Okay, so I was once told that Adobe constructed this panel in such a way that you're meant to go through it in the order that these things are listed, but I don't necessarily agree with that, so we're going to do this a little bit out of sync, and that's just my personal way of doing it. You might have your own way of doing it, and I think that's the brilliant thing about working with RAW. It really does let you kind of imprint your own style into an image, and the bulk of that work gets done in this panel here. So, first things first, the white balance of this shot is a little bit off, so one of the cool things with working with RAW is that the white balance isn't baked into the file, unlike a JPEG. If the white balance is set wrong in a JPEG, a lot of the time that's not something you can really fix very easily. Whereas in a RAW file, it could be as wrong as it could possibly be, and you can always, 100% of the time, save it. It's fantastic. And that's because the white balance is something that doesn't get set by the camera. It's set after the fact once it's saved into a different file format. So, like I say, this is probably a little bit too cool, so I'm going to just drag this over to the right to add some warmth into it. Somewhere around there is pretty good, and I think it's a little bit too green, and I'm kind of using this white line on the road here as my reference. So if you can try and get something white, then it's generally going to look pretty good. So you can counter green by adding some magenta. I think somewhere around there is probably pretty good. I think that's probably not too bad. Okay, now the next cool thing that working with RAW lets you do is you can actually tweak your exposure to, quite a lot actually. Whereas with a JPEG, again, it's harder to kind of do. So we can actually just add a little bit of exposure, and that's just going to brighten the whole image up. Now the next thing down here is contrast, and this is the tab that I generally leave alone because while sure, you can add contrast, it's kind of a very ham-fisted way of doing things. It's a little bit like, working with a sledgehammer when you need like a toothpick. Yeah, it's just I don't really like the way that works. Sometimes if I just need an extra little pump of contrast, I'll do it at the end, but it's never the first thing I do. If you ever want to reset one of these back to the middle, by the way, or its original position, if you double-click it, it will snap back to its starting point. So this is where I start to do things a little bit out of sequence, because the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my black point. And these are sort of the tone controls. And just to kind of explain what these do before I start messing with them, if you look up here at the histogram, as I highlight over each of these, it's going to kind of select a different part of the histogram. So the blacks are dealing with the very, very far left lowest point of the histogram. The shadows are dealing with kind of the next section up. The highlights kind of deal with a big section towards the end, and then the whites deal with the very top point of your image. So that is where your pure white starts to happen, basically. Exposure kind of deals with a bit in the middle. And contrast obviously doesn't appear on there. So the first thing I do is I'm going to bring my black point down, probably further than it should be, but that's because once I've set my black point and I'm kind of happy with where that is, all of that detail that I've just lost in there, I can now bring back with the shadow slider. And this is kind of where I set my contrast. It's kind of like, you could do it with that, but I actually want to fine-tune exactly at what point the contrast kind of lives in my shot, and it's using these 4 controls here that you really do that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my highlights down and then push my white point back up so that they do end up being white. And doing it this way kind of has this almost an effect of broadening the dynamic range of your shot, although not really. It's not the same thing as doing HDR at all. But already, if I hit this button down here, we can do a side-by-side view of before and after, and you can see already what a huge difference that has made to that shot. And it's, night and day in comparison. And that's just, kind of one example of one of the things we're all going to do. I've got a couple more selectively put in here that we're going to have a look at. Now, the other thing that we've got down here is clarity. And clarity is kind of like, the best way I can describe it, it's like edge contrast, and it almost has this effect of sharpening an image, but it's not sharpening. I will stress that very much, but it just makes everything a little bit crisper, a little bit punchier. There's kind of how it was, and then boom, with a little bit of clarity, it can do quite a lot. Now, what you don't want to do is go over the top with it. Equally, because you may have noticed this lives in the middle, you can actually reduce clarity, and you can make it kind of go all blurry and soft and weird, and that doesn't really work so well either. But yeah, a little bit of clarity doesn't hurt. It tends to not look so great in some portraits, but depends what you're doing. And then the final 2 controls that we're going to have a look at today are vibrance and saturation, and you should never really use both of these at the same time, I tend to find. There's not many situations where you need to do that, and that's because they kind of do the same thing but for different images. Now, Vibrance is designed for working with skin tones. It's designed so that if you've got somebody with a brightly coloured jumper, you can make everything in the shot more colourful without ruining their skin tones, because when you try to amp up the colours in skin tones, they tend to look a little bit garish, whereas saturation just does all of the colours. And you can kind of see this quite clearly. If I drag saturation all the way down to the left, then it knocks out all of the colour and kind of makes the image black and white. Whereas if I take vibrance all the way down to the left, it kind of does the same thing, except that it's left the reds and the yellows, and there's probably a little bit orange in a couple of things, so like a bit of orange just up there. And those are kind of the tones that tend to exist in skin colour, which it hasn't really touched. So that's kind of what that control is for. But you know, if you wanted to make everything more colourful, you absolutely can do that. It's not something I tend to touch very often, but sometimes it can just add a little bit of an oomph to a shot. And that's about it as far as the develop module goes. Now, like I say, there are hundreds of controls in here, most of which are very, very cool and let you do some awesome stuff, but I don't think we're really going to mention them too much today. They're probably worth doing another video on. But the one final thing I will show you, and this is just kind of to emphasize like the power of RAW, is we've got this shot here, and one of the things we're dealing with in this shot is we've got a really broad dynamic range that we've tried to capture in here. So we've got the interior of the car, which is very dark, compared to the exterior, which is very, very bright. And, you know, with a JPEG, there's only so much you can do. However, with a RAW file, if we bring this down a little bit, and then what we can do is we can knock the highlights out of it, he says, and then bring the shadows up, and you kind of almost get this HDR effect again, because we're compressing the dynamic range in. So we're lightening up the shadows and darkening down the highlights to kind of bring everything nearer to this middle point. But now that we've kind of got this slightly wishy-washy grey coloured shot, we can put the blacks down and bring the white point back up, and suddenly, if I just make this a little bit warmer as well, and we go back to our before and after view, you can see that we've actually got a lot more detail down in here, and well, maybe not so much in the sky, but you know, you can still tweak it. It's still a lot better than where it started, and that's all thanks to working with RAW files. So the final thing that you're going to want to be able to do, obviously, is now that we've done our edits, how do you get them out of Lightroom? Well, what you have to do is export your photos. So I'm going to hit G to go back to our grid view, and I'm just going to select the two files that we've worked on. You could select all of them, or one of them, or whatever you want to do. And then I'm going to go up to here to File, Export. And it'll bring up this dialog box here, and it's going to give you a few options. So you have to pick where you want to put your photos, how you want to name them, and you've got loads of different ways of naming your files with sequences and numbers and all sorts of stuff like that. And then you've got some settings in terms of your quality and your image size. So if you need like images that are all a maximum of 2000 pixels wide, you can set all that up, and loads of things you can do in here. You can even add watermarks to your shot if that's something you'd like to do. And it's a really, really good little interface, but basically you just kind of pick your settings and hit export, and it's going to now ask me where I want to save them, and we'll just do that. And now it's going to create a little start bar at the top. It's going to export these out, and then we're going to end up with some JPEGs. So basically, if you hadn't caught this already, when you're working with a RAW editor, the basic idea is you start with a RAW file, you tone it, edit it, you know, put the amount of contrast, saturation, sharpening, all that stuff in it, and then you export it as a JPEG as a final image. And from there, you can either just leave it as it is, which is what I personally do most of the time, or if you like, you can go further with it in Photoshop. But I think that is going to do it this time, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and if you'd like to see anything else inside of Lightroom, please let me know, and I'll see what I can do. But that's it for now. My name is Toby, and we'll see you next time.